Welcome to Miami Beach Urban Studios Live Art Talk. I'm Colette Mello, and I'm here today with Miami-based performance artist, researcher, and educator, Letty Bassart. I'd like to thank the City of Miami Beach Department of Tourism and Office of Cultural Affairs for supporting these art talks. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that we reside on occupied lands of Indigenous people. We recognize and honor the Tequesta and the Calusa people who originally occupied these lands before colonization by the Spanish and the English. We honor and pay tribute to the Miccosukee and the Seminole tribes who presently live in the region and have contributed much to our community. Additionally, we honor the African Americans and the Bahamians who came to this area and labored through brutal working conditions to build this city. Letty Bassart is a choreographer, performance artist, and researcher whose works take many forms. She uses her practice to push boundaries and to create trans-disciplinary approaches. Her inter-genre practice has been installed and performed in theaters, concert halls, and other public spaces throughout South Florida. Her works encompass improvisation, endurance, and unpredictability. She is a recipient of numerous fellowships, grants, and commissions. Letty Bassart's work has been recognized by the National Endowment for the Arts and the Knights Art Challenge. She's been commissioned by the Adrienne Arsht Center, the City of Miami Beach, and the Miami Light Project. Letty Bassart received her MFA in dance from the University of California, Los Angeles. She holds a Bachelor's of Science in Nursing from Barry University, and she's a graduate of the New World School of Arts High School. I encourage you to drop any of your comments or questions in the chat below, and I will pose the questions to Letty throughout our conversation. Letty, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to hand the screen to you now.
Hey, great. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today.
So Letty, will you tell us where you are right now?
Yes, I'm in North Miami, actually.
And you're in your studio, or?
I am in my son's room.
Okay.
Which is why I have this background on. He has a very beautiful working computer, and mine is very, very old. So yeah,
Okay.
I took it over. All right, just 1 second.
Sure, take your time.
All right, I'm always more nervous about these things. It's like when I don't perform, you see me backstage with my with the artists that are working with me, shaking off the nerves more so than when there's an event to enact. So welcome everyone again. Thank you for this opportunity to share about my practice and my work. I saw Tom Shakuna and his class there. Thank you all for joining together. It's really wonderful to see a group of people in the Zoom square as well. So should I just jump right in?
Yes, go right ahead.
So, there are many dimensions to my creative practice. And I think that installation work, in particular, improvisation and installation work, have been especially present in works that might be defined as solo works. And I think initially this happened for me because I became very interested in context and thinking about the solo figure and what it means to develop work that can invite others into the mix in a very specific way beyond what might be the proscenium or a flat surface, as happens in other kinds of work, stage work and so on. So here, and just to share, I have some images of very early work. To the left, this was one of my first sort of performance events. And in the background is a work by Matt Schreiber called 500 Watts, where he was actually installing the work. And so we were essentially in the space together as that was happening. And it was my very early introduction to these ideas. And you can see here another very early work. It's called Behind One Wall Another, Detrás de una pared otra. And this was a wall that was fabricated and during the performance was moved. And I performed that in several places in town, from the sort of early Wynwood to Excello and the Design District. And then I think as my work has developed, these kind of installation practices or approaches have also really kind of permeated my stage works as well, or works that might be kind of quasi stage works. And so I just thought I would share. This is an image of a work that was created for New World Center the first year that it opened, with musicians of the New World Symphony, and of course, the various projection capacities in that space. And this last picture here to the right was performed at the Lightbox of Goldman Warehouse, commissioned by Miami Light Project, and was and the installation was a big part of this process. In thinking about what I might talk to you today, I was thinking how creative practice changes so much over time, or can change so much over time. As one is changing, it is also evolving. And sometimes it's hard to remember that because we get so used to articulating what it is that we do, or what our purpose is, or what our niche is within the artistic community. So this talk really gave me a chance to think about what are some elements that have permeated my work, even as my so-called artist statement has changed and completely become dismantled and upended. And so I thought a great deal about intimacy and this idea of intimacy in practice. This is something that really excites me about so-called artistic space. And of course, by intimacy, I don't necessarily mean work that is quiet or subtle or even cozy, but really this opportunity to just dig into something right away and to wrestle and grapple with material that might not otherwise be a space where other spaces don't allow for that kind of grappling. I've also been incredibly interested in the abstracted body and what the body can do when it is neither being pedestrian or executing virtuosic movement or enacting a particular training, whatever that training may be, whether that's athletic training or arts training. But what happens when through one's personhood, that body is actually shifted, changed, rearticulated, used in a different way. And sort of ultimately deconstructed and reconstituted, but not in a way that is fragmented, but in fact, actually bringing a greater coherence to sort of its potential or its capacities. And then lastly, objects. I love objects, working with objects, thinking about objects. And for me, just to define what objects mean, of course, it's material objects, but for me, it is also architecture of the space. It's also clothing and activating clothing and what that does and how that connects it connects us. It's also invisible. So thoughts, words, concepts, all of these things I think are frequently dealt with as objects, or can be thought of as objects in the development of work. So those are the through lines. These are the things that I really started in the last few years to question and rethink and deal with in a very different way. So one is this question of attention. And attention in performance holds a very particular space because, generally speaking, within the conventions of theatrical performance, there's a time when something begins and a time when something ends. And there is an expectation of a certain kind of performance of attention, which is to say, whatever those behaviors are that lead us to think that someone is either riveted or interested, or if the work is quote unquote difficult, that they have the sophistication to endure being with it, that phones are off, that eyes are fixed, whatever these regimes of attention may be that we've come to know and love and lean on, I think is something that for me, I started to really want to undo in my own practice. And secondly, resisting assumptions. So personally, I had become a part of a lot of conversations that were that refer to like the audience, quote, as a collective or as a monolith, things like targeting the audience as one thing, or thinking about people as representative and starting to kind of engage in those kinds of ideas. And so I became very interested in a very radical way to resist also my own assumptions. And this is something that is easier said than done. But it became really a passion project for me to say, I may say, there is something to be said about the notion of empathy, but I also am very aware that I can never know what it is like to be in someone else's position. So that often what is described as empathy is really more projection or self-reflexive. And so I began to really even question my own use of the term or habitual use of the term, and to really think about these ideas about what it means to share something or to create an opportunity for understanding, but to also have a kind of rigorous humility in doing so. So that led me, after a very long time, just to share, to return to create a work that was called Some Ways to Continue. And for me, 20 years into my practice, I was really very clear that whether or not to be an artist becomes completely irrelevant. You are an artist. Now the question becomes, am I going to continue to work in the same way? Though sometimes that way is very satisfying and kind of workable. Or can I really reconsider my approach in a really complete way. And so the idea that came to me was Some Ways to Continue. I thought, is there a way to create a work that rather than demanding time is offering time? And by offering time, I mean a work that says, you're welcome to come and go as you'd like. And whether you stay or you don't stay, quote unquote, you, is not an indication of either the value of my work or your opinion of my work or my opinion of you and your, and your commitment to being with cultural production in some way, my cultural production or those of another. And so a solution became to make a long form work. In this case, 2 6-hour intervals that were performed at UCLA. And within the construct of that, I also wanted to ask myself if I could do that while still being compositionally rigorous and still making something that was connected to dance, so that if someone did stay for 6 hours or came for 6 hours on 2 days, that the experience would be continuing to evolve and change and shift, and have some kind of structural integrity to it. And lastly, I became very interested in this question of work that might be renewable, or this question of something that could keep going. So to step away from this kind of conveyor belt of, show a work in progress at, multiple iterations, and then have a final production, and then have a packaged product that, then the goal is to present it, in different spaces. Could I create something that were built into it, each thing was its own beginning and its own end? So what I'll do is I'll share with you a few short clips, and then we'll talk about it. This, again, was at UCLA in Los Angeles, and a space called Gloria Kaufman Dance Theater, or Room 200. And within some ways to continue what I am, well, I'll let you see it, and then I'll share with you what the directives were. Okay, so in this particular segment, the content of the work, the question, some ways to continue, and dealing with the idea of not whether to continue, but how to continue in this first iteration, I decided to be like wildly literal and think about every piece of advice that one ever receives in response to this question, how to carry on. And so in this short fragment, which was in the first hour of the first day of the performance, which happened between 2 p.m. and 8 p.m., there is an embodiment of aphorisms, and there are 3 that are happening. The first one is safety in numbers and questioning this idea. And so the way that I transcribed that onto my body was to wonder if I could ask sort of like the fleshy, tender portions of my cheeks to seek safety within my teeth, which I thought were very numerous compared to other maybe external body parts. There was follow your nose, and what goes around comes around. So those were abstracted and embodied for those few moments. And I'll share with you this next clip. I wanted to offer kind of a further view of what was happening in the space. So here you can see that a group of students has actually come in to view the work, and I will share this clip. Okay, so I'm actually just going to go ahead and share the next fragment. But along the lines of what I shared, students were invited to take a nap in the space or do their homework in the space, as where it was anyone, within the context of the university. And you can start to see here, and I'll talk about it more later, a bit of how the space was organized as well. Okay, and in this third clip, and again, I'll talk about some of these things in a bit more detail later, I wanted to talk about there were directives in addition to these aphorisms that were also completely spatial. And so I had, in making work and abstracting work, one approach to doing that, right, is to have so many directives that it is in fact impossible to simultaneously execute them. And there's something that becomes incredibly like aspirational about striving toward the unachievable within this frame. And repetition into dissolution could be perhaps another very kind of common improvisational performance device that might be used that I use to achieve these things. And in this case, I had a very specific idea about the seams and curves of both my sweaters and the pleat of my pants to other spaces that are not visible here, but which were like a seismic cord that actually holds the building together, as well as a particular window in the space. And so there was a commitment to a certain relationality, spatial relationality to what was happening in the room. And just to share with you, all of the documentation here, all of the video was done by my colleague, William O'Loughlin. And I actually asked him to document as a viewer. So typically I would have very specific things that I'm trying to illustrate when I ask someone to document and to support me in that way. And I made the choice to experiment with saying, just notice what you notice and film it as another perceiver in the space, not as someone enacting what, my agenda, so to speak. So just to contextualize where the Gloria Kaufman Theater is, because context is so vital, I think, to really considering what was happening in the space. Here you can see, and like FIU, the UCLA campus is very, very large. It's over 400 acres. And you have a very large student body, 55,000 people on campus every single day, and in various capacities. And so here is where this space is located on the north end of the campus. And you can see here that there's a plaza. It's one of the original buildings, one of the 8 original buildings that formed the university. And the theater is actually on the second floor inside of this building. And this is what the inside of the building lobby looks like. So these are the one set of doors. There are multiple doors, but just so you kind of get a sense of what that experience might be. And this is the window that is at the top of that theater space. And I have included here also UCLA's land acknowledgement, which is a longstanding tradition within the Department of World Arts and Culture and /dance. In the early aughts, the building was redone. So it had been the women's gym, and then it became the home to the dance department. And you can see this was a huge renovation, and what was outfitted basically with retractable seating, and you have a movable truss. And so it's one of these, sort of like mega spaces that can do a lot of things, but requires quite a lot of support for those things to happen. I'll share with you here a little bit, a brief clip of what someone in the theater might experience in terms of looking at the space and being with the space. And so that entrance that I showed you is this set of doors here, and the retractable seating is here, and there's also seating here on the second level. One thing that I was really interested in was the porosity of the space in terms of the sound. So there were many events that happened in that plaza that I shared with you. So there was no music that I was creating, and I made it a decision to allow the sounds that were happening outside, often thought of as a nuisance, to kind of enter the space as a material within the work. And that included helicopters, and it included DJ dance party, and it included people screaming and many other things, a soccer game as this was happening.
So Letty, can you repeat what you just said about you were making the sounds or those?
Yes, I'm making these sounds, but the background sound that is coming in and that is being experienced, it's melding with helicopter traffic for the medical campus, and again, just plaza events, the ROTC, the university also has its drills there. So these things are also entering the space.
So were you improvising the performance to go with the sound, the different sounds that were coming in, or how does improvising work with your practice?
It really changes quite a lot. For this particular work, what I did, I scored it to the minute. And so there is a score, what would be referred to as, so a set of directives that I'm following from moment to moment. And then those directives respond to or incorporate whatever else is happening in the space. So I had this very specific rhythm that I was that I set out to do, that also again had these other components associated with it. You can see that you can't see my upper body, but I'm starting to kind of keel over, as it were. And so there is a particular limit to my relationship, to the relationship between my chest and my knees that I'm also keeping here as I'm responding to what's happening outside. Just to share what people who came into this space, I started referring to people as entrants. I didn't know what to call them. Sometimes people say perceivers, but that seemed a little too effortful, perhaps. And so when people walked into the space, they received these directives, of course, enter and exit as you like. And then this information that on the ground level, you're essentially becoming part of, at the very least, the visual landscape of the work. But that there was also the option, if this was not something that interested you, that you could go up to the balcony level and have a more conventional theatrical experience. So I was interested in really giving the people entering the room as much agency as possible, rather than saying, oh, now I'm going to create a work that requires a kind of unlearning of a series of theatrical conventions. It was saying, here's an invitation to this experience or this experience. Again, that was part of my rigorous humility attempt. And I was also very interested in the work being almost atmospheric, so that the architecture and looking at the architecture, looking at the space, having a conversation with someone who was next to you was as important as whatever I might be doing. And so then here again, I offer and reiterate, please go ahead and use your phone, your computer, whatever you want to do. In terms of, you had asked me, Colette, about the improvisational structure. So one of the things that was very challenging in this long form work was keeping a sense of like actual time passing. So what I asked was for the production crew to come in and notify me. A practice within the theater would be to say, you know, 5 minute, your cue and 5 minutes, and you would say, thank you, 5. And so I asked people to come in and give me cues at times that I picked rather arbitrarily, so that if for some reason I had gotten off track, that I would have ways to recalibrate, and to also be careful that in my responsiveness to what was happening, that I wasn't maybe like indulging and not attending to this other piece, which had been the composition that I set out to do. So I'll share how that kind of played out. So in that sequence, there's a variation, and both of these sequences go on for, I don't know, close to 12 minutes, but there's a variation on the rhythm that I shared in the last slide. And you can maybe couldn't hear, but she says where they say it's 5:57. And so the performance began at 2, just to kind of give a sense of what that, you know, what was happening there. Also, just as a matter of evolving the space and of this kind of these layers of containment and addressing, I shared the kind of the broader campus space, and also this layer and this question of clothing and the integumentary system, skin as, you know, as container. That within the walls of the space, there were incorporated into the movement and into the improvisational structure, sort of costume changes that had to do with how the lighting and how the configuration of the space was, so that I was alternating between being camouflaged and also kind of marking artifacts through the use of color of what had transpired in the space. If someone had come earlier and returned, that they would have an opportunity to really experience the relationship between those motifs and those transitions. So here you see me putting one garment into the wall and taking another one out. A major part of the work, in addition to the movement score, was what I referred to as a greeting or conversation score. And I was extremely interested in creating something that was somewhere that was not pedestrian, so to speak, but that was also not within the conventions of performance practice. And so a few ways in which I addressed that. One was that no matter what was happening, I set out to greet every person that I perceived coming into the ground level. in some way by saying hello and thank you for coming at some point during their time there. And then also, rather than taking on these roles of I'm the performer now, or this is my performance, installation, or intervention, and now everyone is in this role of audience, I also was very transparent about my outside relationship to people entering the room. So for example, here, my colleague Barry is in the space, and hugs seem so foreign now, but the dance hug is kind of like I don't know, it's a ritual that is very common in dance, just happens. So I was in the midst of enacting the score, and Barry came in, I dropped the score, to give him a hug, and then return and resume. Here, there's a group, this group I just met on the day of the production. And so there were other things that then became integrated, like a Q&A. So there wasn't a before and after, right? So if people had questions, they were invited to interrupt me for a Q&A in the midst of what was going on. And so they were attending because they were obligated to do so for a class assignment, and were asking me questions that were going to be part of their paper afterward. Here you can see someone that is leaving the space, and this was very funny, even though I had invited people to enter and exit as they wanted. I found that people mostly exited when I turned away from where they were. So there was this kind of hesitation to like walk out of the space. Here is a group of colleagues who were participating in a repertory project, and so they all came in together, and this is me, but they all just kind of gathered around here. And then you can see here, again, this is another group of students to which I had different relationships. So some of these students had been in my class, and others I was meeting for the first time. And here you see a young person who is required to document that she had made it to the show, and so was taking a selfie with, in the midst of that. And then again, you can see how there are these sort of choreographies that are happening regardless of whatever I set out to do. Just
Such an interesting project. I mean, it's just an observation on human nature, right? The way people would enter or, would be nervous about leaving in front of you. Cause I would feel that way. Like we're so conditioned that you don't leave a performance, you sit through it or till intermission, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I did everything that I could to relay that it was okay. But often, especially because I was greeting people, so that was one of the things, because they weren't present in the room anonymously, especially on the ground level, right? I received feedback from people that they felt so deeply included, which is different from being asked to, say, participate in a very prescribed way, which was very positive. And then I also received feedback from a colleague who was like, I just couldn't leave. Like, I just felt like I had to stay. Once you said my name, like, or greeted me, and then I felt like now I'm part of this thing and I have to stay. So those things were being played out definitely in the space.
Very interesting.
Yeah. And for me too, it was interesting because it did work out that there was always at least one person other than the production team in the room. But I did have those reservations, and I had done runs of the performance where I also realized that as much as I wanted to dehabitualize, that I was attached to this kind of like, it's the end, I get to say hello to, I don't know, like these kinds of things that were also part of my own habits. I have the next several slides are still images that I thought I would share just to offer some different perspectives. You can see here the lighting trees with a combination of work lights and so-called cams. The truss, which typically would be up very high, was lowered as low as it could be lowered within sort of liability standards. Marley, which is this flooring that is often used in dance practice to make the floor better for movement, quote unquote, better for movement. and it rolls out this way, and it's very, very expensive. We installed it in kind of a semi-cruciform shape on the floor. And then you can see, you know, just kind of the stairways and all the various entrances to the space. This is the retractable seating. My colleague Arsenio had the idea to actually illuminate the backs of this so that you could really see. So if you were close up, it's a little bit difficult to see here. You could actually see the folded chairs and spend some time just kind of looking through these grates. So it's sort of like a theatrical seating voyeurism or something that could happen. You know, so you could just stand there and just look completely away and give your back to the space. And here again, another just image of the performance and a different costume. This is just a close-up view and zoomed out view of, again, this is maybe the 4th hour on the of what the space looked like. And then again, another iteration. And again, my own adaptation, if people chose to lay down, I think as we were talking about, you know, what that did in terms of also my configuration. And so often then I was performing what I had intended maybe to do vertically along the floor, on the floor, against the floor, or facing upward as a way of addressing or honoring those choices as well. Lastly, I thought I might just share with you, particular if anyone, students are interested in more, there's just so much research about long form work and the question of duration and what makes something durational. This was a very early study. These photos were done. I was in the studio and my colleague Lydia was in Charlotte. So I was in LA and she was in Charlotte. This was pre-COVID. Now this seems so common, but we had an interest in thinking about the co-creation of an environment and the documentation of what that might look like, so that even though I was a living, breathing person, she was working with me almost as like an avatar or digital figure, you know, in her space.
Oh, that sounds so interesting. And you did that before?
Yeah, I did that before COVID. Yeah. I was interested in portals and, you know, of course, time and, you know, all of these other elements. And all the things I mentioned, intimacy and abstraction, you know, and ways that actualizes between people. I listed here, and I'll send you, Colette, and I can share with you, you know, anyone who is participating, you know, links. There are many, many artists who, of course, have experimented and performed long form work or durational work. And again, you know, I think of durational as being, in some sense, counter to whatever the institutional time is of a space. So durational work could be very short or very long. But in this case, I was looking at long form work. And these are some artists who are rooted in dance and also enact these kinds of projects. There are many, many other artists, Bob Wilson, you know, within the theatrical canon, and of course within the performance art canon that are engaged with this work as well. And then lastly, I thought I might just share with you a little bit about some studies that I have going on right now. So one is some ways to continue, and I refer to this as the B-sides, very tongue-in-cheek. And so I've continued the practice and the performance of the work in my carport. And so this is my carport. I'm working on another sort of more fantastical project involving pelicans and the mythology of pelicans and the abstraction of that mythology through the body. So this is an image of a pouch. I'm working on deconstructing 1980s dance movies and all of the problematic representation there, in particular, looking at Flashdance, which had been such an iconic film for me, but which is also so deeply problematic in other ways. And a ballet installation. I started this workshopping this at Smith College with the students there. And so this is an image of that workshop. But very specifically, it's a long form ballet installation. Its working title is Three Women on Point with Mops. And it's really taking ballet on as a vernacular form and connecting the sort of labor and the domesticity and the gendered idea of ballet, along with this kind of image of mopping and athleticism. And so that's the picture there. This is my contact information if anyone would like links, or if you're interested in a fuller iteration of the work. I certainly have lots and lots of documentation I'm happy to share. Yeah, thank you so much for this shared time.
Thank you, Letty. That was really wonderful, fantastic. I'm interested in how, and I invite anyone, if you have any questions or comments, to please put them in the chat, please. What do you, I mean, space must be very important as a dancer, choreographer. Can you talk about how that comes into play into your practice? Like you were saying, the space you were at UCLA looks beautiful, but then you said now you're working on something in your carport. Can you talk about how do you transform that? Or then you also talk about the practice with your colleague in South Carolina, where she was directing you in your space. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Totally. Yeah. So space. I mean, I think within the question of like theatrical lineages, this question of space is huge, and what spaces are intimate, what spaces are pared down from all of the sort of razzle dazzle and mysticism and wonder of the theater, and what opportunities that creates. And so for me, the space is always very, very present. I think at the beginning I talked about intimacy and space, and I think a lot of times things are counterintuitive. So a space that might seem very private becomes much less intimate than a space sometimes that is more public. So in a theater, for example, or even a so-called environmental work might delve into territory that pedestrians walking on the sidewalk or the mail carrier, as I'm enacting this in my carport, have a very different, so people have relationships to spaces as well as whatever my relationship is to the space, of course. And this idea of, crossing distance and digital space and, nowhere space, I think all of that is, or being in multiple places at once. In other words, being connected to maybe people in the room next to you, and then also being connected to people across another time zone in another space. I mean, all of those things, we're very capable of holding all of that. And I think in the same way that I think about physical directives that are aspirational and sometimes buttressing each other, and other times creating a kind of taut, productive conflict. I would say that that's very similar for me with space as well.
Can you talk about a little bit how the pandemic affected your practice? And also answer that first, and then I have one more question.
Wait.
Are you there?
Okay.
Oh,
the pandemic.
Right. Yeah, I was just going to say how's that affected? I'm sure it must have had a huge impact.
Yeah, it's interesting because we talked about this before we hopped on the call, and I said, oh my gosh, the pandemic, it's affected my practice in such a huge way. And then I took a step back and I thought, what was really interesting for me, because I returned to this kind of performance practice that involved even pre-pandemic, I mean, hours and hours. I emptied out, my 1-bedroom apartment in Los Angeles to rehearse it, because the demands of rehearsing a durational project, are very specific. So I had been involved in a performance practice way before, and I was able to continue that in a way that was not so different. I think what is different for me is that I came home, so-called home, to Miami just before the pandemic happened. And that was something that in a way I'm very thankful for, and another way I wasn't prepared for. So I had imagined that I was going to go from LA to some other town that wasn't Miami. And so coming back for me has been, has required a very specific kind of reconciliation with the landscape and my own relationship to the city. Which sometimes I say that what makes me a person from Miami, or someone that hails from Miami, is that in many ways it doesn't feel like home, but it is home because the people that I'm most intimately connected to are here.
Nice.
Physically, yeah.
Nice. How do you collaborate? How does collaboration work into your practice? Is it a big part of it, or is
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I think, the concept of co-creation is very pivotal to performance practice. And it's something that's been very present for me from like from my very earliest readings and listening to videos of Toni Morrison say, all work is co-created, even something that seems fixed like a text. And so collaboration is present with every person that is sharing in the work. And then it is also present, of course, I have longtime collaborators, someone like Lydia, who's my colleague in Charlotte, and I have worked together for over 10 years on multiple projects. I've worked on with various composers. Also, there starts to become a shorthand in that process. And when I create stage works, I very much work in the tradition of devised theater, where I'm in the role of almost like facilitator, engaged in a very vigorous set of directives and requesting for movement to be created, and then also involved in very aggressive editing together as a group. And so collaboration is part of, it's part of everything, I think, even when it doesn't seem so. In this particular work that I shared, there were, I rehearsed the dance alone, but mostly alone. My son, I refer to as my rehearsal companion in the work. But there were 2 entire classes at UCLA that were involved in actually being present in the theater during that time, as well as all of the lighting design, as well as the many people who had to kind of be involved in the logistics, like institutional logistics that are part of making something like that happen, so that it's irreverent and reverent at the same time. And that requires a lot of collaboration.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it was so wonderful to meet you and to learn about your practice. And I really look forward to maybe coming to a performance, a face-to-face or a virtual one. If you have something that you're working on, I would love to see that. And I just want to thank you again, and thank all of our guests for joining us today. And everyone, please stay safe. And I have a couple comments here. I'm sorry, I should get to them. I totally, thank you so much. Your work is fantastic. Let's see, I'm really impressed about your internal work. I can see the deep quality of time for doing it. Reflection of your movements can bring by surprise. What is a major relationship during the performance, your feeling or space or movement? That's a good question.
I think within that work, there was, although I created the parameters for the work, the actual kind of meditative space that kind of performance, that kind of vigorous physical performance requires is almost doesn't operate on this pedestrian conversational plane. So there were times, because I didn't have that experience until I actually shared the work of this, enacting this score, this greeting score, which I was incredibly devoted to, basically saying, you are more important than the work. And I want that to be very clear, even if I've never met you before, that is the work, really. How to continue, with love and rigor and compassion. And it was not easy, because there were times when you enter a certain kind of zone, right? That kind of practice requires, especially because I wanted it to be not necessarily repetitive, but so it was very difficult to hold the directives for those many directives with such specificity, and also hold the physicality stamina wise, and also say I love you to like my lifelong friend entering the space. And so I hope that answers the question.
That was a great answer and a great way to, end the conversation. Thank you so much again, Letty. And wonderful work. And thank you everyone for joining us. And I hope everyone stays safe, and hopefully we'll all see each other face to face soon.